Welcome to another Lombardi Live. My guest today is killing it right now in the band he's in, and at a very early age he's already done some really amazing things in his career. And he also brings something else to my attention. I've always said that I think there's a drumming gene, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Thank you for joining me, Jay Weinberg.
All right, thanks for having me, Don. It's a pleasure to join you today.
And I want to congratulate you on the award that you got recently, which is Metal Drummer of the Year in Modern Drummer. I think that's happened twice, too. How did that come about, and what do you think you did most to prepare for that?
Well, I appreciate that, Don, and I don't really know. You know, I feel like I'm kind of too in the middle of it to understand it, but I certainly appreciate it. You know, I really appreciate the support from not only Modern Drummer, but the whole readership of Modern Drummer, the drum community at large, the metal community at large, our amazing Slipknot fans. You know, there's a whole multitude of factors that go into, you know, receiving a recognition like that. And I think it's also just a testament, you know, to the community of drummers that I'm so fortunate and feel so honored to, you know, be amongst guys who, you know, are pushing the instrument, pushing themselves within the instrument and the music that we're all making. So to be among all those guys is really the honor, you know, in and of itself. You know, it's just such a privilege to be one with this community that I've cherished since a very young age. And to receive a recognition like that is kind of totally mind blowing. I don't really know how to make sense of it, really. But I think it's maybe just a signal to just kind of keep doing my best and trying my best at what I do with my bandmates. And, you know, it's I don't know. I think maybe it's a kind of signpost along the way of like, you're doing some good things. So hope to keep that going.
We're going to talk in a little bit about what it must feel like to see a band when you're 9 or 10 years old and think they're really cool and then end up playing with them 10 years later. That's like,
right. Yeah.
Call it the American dream, I think, and it works, right?
Yeah, it's certainly worked for a decade now. Yeah.
He is the heartbeat of Slipknot, as you most always know out there, being drum channel. I take that as an assumption. Your double bass chops are amazing. For young drummers out there, do you have a practice routine as far as building that in endurance? What would you suggest they might do to gain that?
It's, you know, nothing that I think would necessarily blow people's minds other than just kind of, you know, keeping consistency, of course, is one thing. And, you know, having a kind of practice schedule or a routine of sorts that allows me to kind of, I guess, identify the things that I like to work on, the things that get my, you know, my blood going, especially on like a show day. That's so much of my warm up and practice routine is with, you know, our big event at the end of the night in mind. So a lot of it is kind of like staying limber. A lot of it, one thing that I didn't realize so much that I started to realize kind of in my mid-20s was how much hydration is such a key part of drumming as a whole, but certainly as far as like stamina and playing, you know, with both your feet and stuff, hydration is key, because if I'm not well hydrated at the end of the night, I feel like my arms and legs are like cement blocks and I can hardly move them correctly. So I always know if I haven't hydrated properly. But yeah, you know, a consistent routine of, you know, warming up to a metronome and starting out slow, working up, you know, fast, kind of the tried and true methods that I learned from drummers who came before me, who are like, you know, there's no cheat codes. It's really just being consistent with it and applying yourself. And so, yeah, a lot of just kind of ramping up from, let's say, 110 BPM, 16th notes, all the way to, you know, 200 or something like that. And there are guys that, you know, go crazy, like 500 beats per minute kind of stuff. That's not really the music that I play. And I admire that talent. But I feel, you know, the double bass that I play kind of suits my style, our music, of course. Of course, there's a history within Slipknot's music of that. So it's a necessity that's there. So you always kind of have to practice it and just keep those chops up and keep that consistency up.
It's interesting you say that so easily, you know, it's just the consistency, but that's the lesson, I think. Consistency is really difficult for young drummers. So they're not just involved in the chop side of doing it, but as you do it, it's very much a part of the underlying rhythm of the song.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, kind of bringing together a schooled approach of knowing, having an understanding of the know-how of doing this stuff, and also meeting that with, your ambitions as a musician, your energy, your tenacity, because so much of what we do, especially the music that we make, is very instinctual. It's very emotionally driven. It's not necessarily like mathematically driven or anything like a lot of modern kind of metal is. Ours is more kind of just from the gut and from the heart, and so it's very rough around the edges, very raw, but we like it that way. So there's kind of like, it's one of those things where you try to bring your technical proficiency and your vibe together. Those are my favorite drummers, are the drummers who bring a high level of technical proficiency with a high degree of character and charisma and vibe to their playing. And when you bring those things together, that makes for something that's engaging to listen to and exciting.
What age were you when you actually started playing drums?
I started playing drums when I was 14 years old, about freshman year of high school. I think that's when I started to really identify with a subculture of music in, metal and punk rock and hardcore and stuff like that. I started to find a home in that. And I think at 14, I felt encouraged just within myself to be like, I want to participate in that somehow. I want to be in a band. I want to be around bands. That's when that really started for me. Obviously, with my father being a drummer and being on tour with them a lot when I was younger, I had exposure to musicianship at a high caliber. But it wasn't until like the Ramones and punk rock really stripped everything down to, basic raw energy, like that translated something to me around my early teens. So yeah, about 14 years old was when I started.
If non-drummers are watching out here, speaking of his father, it's Max Weinberg, legendary drummer with Bruce Springsteen's E Street Band.
That's right.
And I think he had mentioned to me drums weren't your first instrument. Is that right? You'd taken some other lessons prior to that? And how important is that for young drummers, you think, to expand their horizons?
I actually think it's very helpful. It certainly is helpful, especially when you're then collaborating with other musicians. You can, kind of give yourself a leg up in your creative dynamic if you understand the lingo of your guitar players and your bass players and your vocalists and keyboardists and stuff like that. So you're right. I started on guitar when I was about 9. The thing was, though, at the time, I didn't want to take lessons. I was swamped with schoolwork, and I didn't want to have additional schoolwork in my music, after school. So I started on guitar because I was really drawn to the instrument. But then taking lessons, I was like, it's just like school. I don't want to do it. So then when it came time to play the drums, even though I had a fantastic, teacher in my dad, who showed me many things off of the kit. But when it came time to he kind of said to me, do you want me to give you lessons? Do you want to go to take drum lessons in the town, 5 minutes away? And I was like, I just want to do this for myself. I just want to teach myself, play along to my Ramones records, my Metallica records, my Slayer records, and teach myself what I love about this music, similar to his experience. And, so that freedom allowed me to really discover what I wanted to do with the instrument myself. But having that proximity to, seeing not just him, but going to visit, the Late Night with Conan O'Brien tapings and going to see a number of bands that would go on and play supporting their new record. That's part the whole story of how I met the guys in Slipknot to begin with. So the exposure to drumming, real up close and personal, came years before my actual playing. But I think it was certainly, my drive, I think, to pick up the instrument was inspired by years of absorbing those drummers, probably, subconsciously, but certainly to a high degree that made an impact on me.
And those are actually drum lessons in my mind. It reminds me of, some people say Buddy Rich never took a lesson and he was self-taught, but his parents were the #1 vaudeville act, kind of your life situation. He was around the best drummers in the world every day from the time he was born. And how could you get a better, it's not like you got to be there at 3 o'clock at the local music store, but you're getting entrenched with all this information.
Yeah, and there's absolutely something to that. A friend of mine once said that the institution of education isn't necessarily imperative, but education in itself is, and whether that's you seek out the education yourself by surrounding yourself with, people who are doing stuff where you can't even conceive of how to begin with that, but it's something you're drawn to. And then if you have the brain and the, like a lot of drummers who are my peers, I think a lot of us kind of have the brain of that monkey see, monkey do. How is that guy doing this thing? I'm going to try to kind of do that for myself. And even if you don't sit down with one another and absorb kind of, school, like classroom lessons, I think, that is key to being a musician, is taking in education from all musicians, as a drummer, all drummers. I'm so fortunate when we go on tour, I'm constantly playing shows with guys that I look up to, guys that I admire, and it's just an honor that's my big, that's like going to school every day, is playing shows with guys that I'm just like, I worship these dudes. So yeah, that education is, the institution you can bypass, but the education in itself is imperative.
I love that message. And here you are in the middle of it, because you're going to be inspiring a lot of people that are watching us. I always say on Drum Channel, we have the lessons behind the drum set, behind the practice pad, but I think you learn just as much and sometimes more by getting into the interviews and the shows that we have, hearing people talk about their careers, how they did what they did, how they hit those. I mean, I think everybody hits certain blocks as you're developing, and it's like, how do you work past that? One of the things we have is practice, patience, and perseverance. It kind of takes those three. Being prepared. I mean, look at your dad's history. He took advantage of all these opportunities that came in because, know it or not, like yourself, he had prepared himself through it from the various other gigs that he had taken. When you played and you were practicing, you talked a little bit earlier, we did, about consistency. Did you use a metronome a lot as part of your normal practice routine?
Of course, yeah, that's a huge tool, available to all of us. That was kind of, it's funny you mentioned that, because that was my handshake deal with my dad, because he understood, like, okay, I get that you don't want to, take lessons and be turned off to the instrument because it's like school. But he's like, I'll let you teach yourself on one condition: you practice to a metronome and you keep really good time. And I think that was, for himself, it's like, I think he didn't want his son to be a drummer out in the world with bad time and have it reflect on him, like, oh, what happened to your kid? He doesn't keep good time. So that was kind of our deal, was as long as yes, you can play along to your Ramones records and your Mastodon records and stuff, but you must practice to a metronome and understand what pocket is, what groove is, what keeping a sensible and responsible meter is, because that was a huge part of his career as well. I think his playing really took off in the late 70s, maybe early 80s, when he started working with a metronome. And they would tell me stories all the time how my mom was a school teacher. She would come home from school and pull into the driveway, and she would hear the metronome from the driveway every single day, because that was my dad finding what it meant to have a responsible meter for the music that you're playing. And so that transcends all genres. My dad and I play very different genres from each other, but we share commonality in wanting to keep that responsible meter for our bandmates, because that's what makes impactful music, is when you're all tight like that. And if you're all over the place, you start to kind of lose the plot.
With the band, do you use click tracks? Are you using a way in which you would have a metronomic time going when you're playing?
We don't live. We don't use a metronome live. Occasionally in the studio. And my preferred way that we do things is when we say we're coming up with a new song and we are able to rehearse it a lot, play it till we know the song back and forth, and oftentimes we'll build songs in the studio with the metronome, with a kind of a tempo map, even as we're analyzing the granular changes in a song, like, oh, this, it should dip in this part, maybe 1 or 2 BPM. Let's see what that kind of feels like. And if that gives the riff or the cadence of the vocal a more of a feel of what we're looking to do. And so that's a helpful tool. And what we'll often do is, for example, on our album We Are Not Your Kind, which came out 4 years ago, that album we practiced a lot. We practiced all those songs start to finish. We had vocals in mind with it, and we were able to get a sense of the whole song as a composition. And then once we felt comfortable with that, we would throw the metronome away. We would remember those kinds of shifts, like, oh, really lean back into the pocket in this part, really charge forward in this part. And then that gives the push and pull that we have with each other on stage, because we don't use a metronome live on stage. I think we like kind of capturing what we call as the temperature of the show, the kind of specific vibe of that night. So we're really catering the experience that we're all sharing, you know, us, the band, and the audience. It's a one-of-one moment. You're not going to see another show quite like it. Even if you come to 2 shows in a row, they're going to be different somewhat. That's important to us. So, but there are occasions where we do record with a click, maybe some of the slower songs. You know, we will, just to keep a sense of that real groove and keep everything tight. If we're building kind of a record as we're recording it, a lot of that will be done to a click. But then once we get on stage, we really like to just listen to each other and have that natural push and pull that we have that that we feel kind of maximizes the impact we're trying to deliver on unsuspecting audiences.
I'd have to say that's a real compliment to you. So if we go back to what you just said, I'll put a little different spin on it. When you go on stage, you throw the metronome away. Your bandmates throw the metronome away. You are the one that's taking the metronome's place as the drummer in the band. They're having enough trust and confidence in you that you're going to be able to keep it. And I love the feeling of it being live on stage, because you just mentioned something else. There's a little bit of ebb and flow. Stress and release, we call it a lot on Drum Channel. But there's nothing wrong if a band picks up a little bit, you know, maybe on the bridge, lays back a little bit. That's how you're listening to each other all the time. And you're following them, or they're following you, or how do you kind of feel it as you're playing live?
It's a delicate dance that I've had to grow accustomed to over the last 10 years. For example, it's often something we speak of, you know, when we're in the studio, the dynamics of everybody in the band. Particularly, I have really, you know, quite loud in my in-ear monitors, our guitar player's hard pan. And we're blessed with 2 of the best guitar players who've ever walked the earth in our band. And, but they're incredibly different players. You know, Mick, who's on my left, is a very death metal, very, you know, intensely metronomic kind of a player. Very, you know, you can hear the articulation in every note. It's very intense and like rigid in a good way, where it delivers that kind of like very defined attack in that sound. And Jim, who's on my right, also complements that in a really great way with a lot of kind of dancing around those notes and more fluidity to his playing. So they're 2 incredible styles together in one band. And I kind of fit kind of right between the 2 in a way. And I've had to learn and grow accustomed to that dynamic. Whereas, you know, the aggressive attack of one guitar can push the song, and the fluidity and danciness of the other guitar kind of lays back into the groove. And if I find my way in between them, it oftentimes results in a note that's really just a lot fatter than if we were all just kind of metronomically on the note together. You know, that creates that human space that is, you know, that allows for a lot. Those notes become emphasized and they become much fatter than they would if they were, like I said, just all kind of stacked on top of each other, metronomically perfect. I enjoy that. We enjoy that impact that we deliver. But yeah, so it's a lot about listening to each other. You know, I'm listening to our vocalists as well in that cadence, and how everything is kind of, you have to kind of always be constantly computing as you're doing the thing, you know, and understand this guy's pushing, this guy's dragging, this guy's, you know, right in the middle or whatever. we are kind of all over the place, but that's kind of a little bit of the charm of Slipknot, is that ferocity in how we kind of have all these lanes that sync up, but it's an incredibly fat kind of sonic space that we take up because we are fitting around each other in those kind of artistic ways that we, take from each other's strengths in certain ways.
I think we simplify it sometimes on Drum Channel, just saying what you're doing with the band is what we're doing. You're having a conversation. Somebody says something, you react to it, you go back and forth, you stop, they start. Difference is you have to be the one that keeps it consistent. And some of the best bands of all time that I know we like and you do in your jazz background, listening to all those records with your dad, sped up a lot. And nobody complained about that. It was all part of the feeling of what was going on. Speaking about your dad and the band, a lot of people came to know you first when you had the opportunity to sit in with the band. And it was kind of like, oh, okay, well, his son's going to do it. Well, let's see how that works. Then it was like, I guess I can't say holy shit, but I will. It's like he killed it and nailed it. So that had to have a lot to do with you looking at different styles of music that you play when you grew up, or being so much entrenched in you that you knew what that feeling was and what you needed to do. But how did that moment feel when it was like, why don't you try sitting in? Was it right away, okay, I'm going to do it? Or was it a little bit like, well, I'm not so sure?
Oh, I was scared to death, and I appreciate all that. I mean, for some context, I was the last of the children of the E Street Band members to really get up on stage with the band and play. In fact, my sister had done it years before when she was about 12 or 13. My older sister, she got up and played keyboards with the band, and I was in awe of that. I couldn't believe that, somebody who wasn't in the band was all of a sudden up there and doing that. And, my pre-teenage sister was doing that. It blew my mind. But for me, and of course I took to, playing instruments a little bit later, if I'm messing up on the drums in front of tens of thousands of people, there's no way that you can like duck me in the mix. It would be a complete catastrophe. So I never did it. I never, I had been asked if I would do it, and I was like, that's just too nerve-wracking. It's not for me.
But it wasn't doing it. You would have been asked in a way of just trying it as a lark because you're a family member. It wasn't like an audition for the gig.
No, exactly. Yeah, it's just to have some fun and be I mean, I would be on tour with them all the time ever since I was 9 years old. I'd go on the road with them, and that was my first kind of real touring experience, or traveling the world at least, was like being with them and seeing how they do it and absorbing that professionalism and that tenacity, which I now see in myself and my peers. It's one and the same. It's different music, but it's the attitude is exactly the same. So then fast forward a couple years later, when I was 17, the band had a homestand at Giant Stadium. It's something ridiculous, like 10 shows at Giant Stadium or something. And so my dad asked if I would want to play a song at soundcheck. And I was like, okay, I'll play a song at soundcheck in an empty building. I'll get to say that I played at Giant Stadium, even though I'll be at an empty Giant Stadium. But that was kind of, what we agreed to. So I hopped up at soundcheck and played the song Born to Run. And Bruce felt it was, he was like, hey, that sounded pretty good. You want to play that actually during the show? And when you're asked by the man himself, how do you say no? Like I can't just pass that up. So I think being absolutely terrified, but wanting to live up to that moment. And this band is literally my blood family and people who I've known since I was a little baby, so I trust in them, and they wanted it to be, a fun, positive experience. So I did that. And it went great. We played it well. I got through the song. But then a couple months later came this interesting, odd timing schedule between the start of The Tonight Show, as Conan O'Brien was moving from the late night program to The Tonight Show out in Burbank, which my dad had to be at the beginning of that taping in the beginning of June 2009, and I just started college. And Bruce just so happened to have scheduled a tour to start May 31st. So all of a sudden, my dad had to be in two places at once. And it came to the minds of primarily Steve Van Zandt, the guitar player in the E Street Band and like an uncle to me. Between himself, Bruce, and my dad, they kind of came to the consensus like, okay, well, Jay figured out one song, maybe he can learn several hundred others, and well, let's give it a shot. Let's keep it in the family. Let's figure out if this can work. And they took a real shot in the dark that I'm forever grateful for. It didn't come easy by any stretch. The expectation was that the tour was to not miss a beat, and that expectation would be resting on my shoulders, and I just had to live up to that moment and deliver to the best of my ability. So that's what I hope I was able to accomplish on that tour.
You couldn't have picked a better song for you to initially sit down and play. Born to Run. I mean, yeah. That's perfect song to say that you were, and you did, and it came out really good.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
And the experience, and it's always interested for young drummers to hear in terms of in your career, if you ever had to audition for a gig, what that was like. And I believe they knew what you were doing by the time you got into Slipknot. It was just a matter of inviting you into the band. But in prior experiences, had you had to audition for bands before? And what would you encourage young drummers to prepare for if they're sitting down for the first time in a band?
It's interesting. Well, that's a great question. In my experience, with the bands I've been in and stuff, it always came from a sense of like friendship first, the need for a drummer second, and then are you around? Do you want to play with us? Do you want to be in our band? That was the case in Madball. That was the case in Against Me. I played with a band called Kvelertak from Norway. For a brief period of time. That was kind of even more of a trial by fire. We hadn't even ever met before, but it's always kind of been, what are the parameters of what is being asked of me, to come into a project that's existed with a history, with a catalog, and trying to break down, the elements of where I fit in, and how I can kind of do my own thing within it and have the music ring as true, as genuine, as an authentic, representation of what I'm contributing to the project. But yeah, essentially, with the band Madball, it was kind of like, hey, we have a tour coming up in 2 weeks. We need a drummer. Are you around? Can you do it? Same thing with Against Me. You're a good friend of ours for years. We need a drummer. Are you around? Can you do it? That was kind of, these situations that I found myself in and wanted to rise to the occasion. And to me, I think, having the enthusiasm that I did and that I do for this music, coming in just as prepared as possible and making, what could be potentially, a period of uncertainty for, some friends of mine who need a drummer. If they're like, oh, what are we going to do? Is this going to work out? I want to come in and deliver instantaneously some reassurance that it's going to work out. That's kind of what I felt was my task in that moment. So for example, with Against Me, I was only, my buddy Andrew is the bass player in the band. He had asked me like, hey, we have a couple shows coming up and we need a drummer for 3 shows. This is the set list. Would you be down to play these couple shows with us? And I'm like, absolutely. Like one of my, favorite bands growing up. So to me, this is my opportunity to, in a context where it won't be annoying to them, where I'm like, I never saw you play this song. Let's play this song. I never saw you guys play this song. Let's play this song. And just be, just get to live out that moment of celebrating this music that I really love. So I'll come into, our first jam session knowing everything. That felt very important to me. And that was, I think if I've never really thought about it, but I think that was, my training with the E Street Band of literally, it was expected of me to know 300 plus songs. because that was the catalog that we were drawing from and that we would definitely be playing. So that allowed me to learn songs very quickly, or come up with shorthand that allowed me to break down songs and understand songwriting patterns in a group or with an artist, and translate to that myself very quickly, so that I can come into a situation where it's like, all right, what songs of ours do you know? And be able to say to them, I know everything. Like, what songs do you want to play? So that's always been very important to me. However, the best I can prepare for making what could be a difficult transition, to make that easy, and more than easy, exciting for a band. That is kind of what I felt was my responsibility in that moment. So to turn up those dials all the way with Slipknot, even though, it was a complete secret, I didn't know that I was auditioning for the band Slipknot. But we had a long history. We had been friends for 13 years or something at that point. They had seen me grow up. They knew that I knew everything about the band. And then when we sat down to play with each other, they said, like, what songs do you know? And I was like, I know all of them. What do you guys want to play? And I think that was, if I were to guesstimate, it was not just reassuring, but kind of exciting, of like, okay, here's a guy who we don't need to teach about our band, and we don't need to walk him by the hand and ask him to learn a bunch of stuff. Here he knows it. And so that has always felt very important to me, and very actionable, to just be a ready and active participant in this music scene, is to do the homework and enjoy doing the homework of going to shows, watching the bands, studying the records, understanding where these songs came from, and the minutia of all those things, not with the expectation of, and one day I'll play those songs, but just because I get the sheer joy of being a participant in this music community. And I think that, in a way, just kind of being my day-to-day practice, has led to some interesting, moments and opportunities where, if I'm being asked to, come in the door into the studio to play with somebody, I don't want to just come into the door. I want to knock the door down. That's kind of what I feel is my prime directive as a musician. Maybe that was the way I was raised, the way I was kind of bred, and I saw the intensity of the E Street Band at an early age, and I just that's the only way I know how to do it. But it's yielded some interesting, musical moments along the way. So I'm definitely thankful for that.
When you said you went out and did those couple of dates, did you actually write cheat sheets at all? I mean, to learn all those songs, were they totally by memory, or did you put a title of a song down and make a little cheat sheet as to different figures or fills?
No, that was all just by memory from being a legit fan. I mean, those guys knew me from, screaming my lungs out at the front of the barricade at their shows for years. So they knew I knew everything.
You were air drumming everything, whether you were in the band or not, right? Yeah,
exactly. So coming in and that's largely true for, playing with Slipknot as well. The flip side of that is, there are situations that I've had to be prepared for in a different way, where I wasn't familiar with the music, to the degree that I was with, say a band that I was a legit, hardcore fan of. And that was true in the case of the band Kvalertak from Norway. Their drummer had an injury, an arm injury on their first headlining tour in the US. And, a friend at the record label had reached out to me like, hey, I've got a band that's on tour in the US and they need a drummer tomorrow. Can you fly out and learn, their whole set on a flight tomorrow? And for myself, I kind of always like setting a challenge for myself like that, that I believe is doable, but I don't necessarily know if I'm ready to do it, but I want to give it a shot. And so I accepted and basically had 24 hours to cram a quite complex, if you are unfamiliar with the music, it does have a degree of complexity to it, kind of long arrangements of like 9-10 minutes. None of the songs are in English. There were some difficult challenges to figure out shorthand and how to do this. So yeah, I don't know how to write or read music in the traditional sense, but I have come up with a shorthand that served me playing with Bruce in the E Street Band, where I can write, verse, riff, 2 times, chorus, reintro half as long, and stuff like that. And I can kind of make sense of it and understand my own shorthand to then realize, like I said, songwriting patterns where I'm like, oh, okay, I see this is kind of how they go into that type of a part. That's kind of the musical character of this band. That'll help me in trying to ingest a large amount of information in a very short amount of time. And that's not unique to me. A lot of my favorite drummers do very similar things. Josh Freese is a great example of that. I've read him talking about having a similar kind of philosophy of being able to dissect the intent of a song and deliver on what it needs quickly. And I think, my training in the E Street boot camp certainly helped with that. I don't know if I'd have the muscle memory without that diligence and, requiring me to have that application. But once I kind of unlock that for myself, then it's like, oh, it's so much easier to collaborate. I use that a lot with inside our creative process with Slipknot. As we're building a song, it'll help me. I remember the first time we jammed, the second day we jammed, we started working on new material. And so it's kind of like, hey, here's a song, go listen to it. In 20 minutes, come back into the studio and play what you would play to it. And so, that would be daunting if I didn't have, that training or the way of breaking down a song into, sections or whatever. And we all do that to certain degrees. But to be able to do that with new information quickly became like a very advantageous tool to have kind of in my arsenal.
Yeah, it's just this is the direction I was thinking. We actually have a course Greg Bissonette did. He's a master at that, what we call cheat sheets. You're not reading music. You're just like start, stop, chorus, play a fill here. If there's anything that's syncopated, you put it in.
If I may, I'll give you one funny story. So back in 2009, the E Street Band had a show at the legendary Philadelphia Spectrum. I believe it was the last show at the Spectrum before they tore it down or repurposed it, something like that. And one of the old school Bruce songs that they were wanting to introduce to the set at that time was a song called Kitty's Back, which predates my dad joining the band. It's with Vinny Lopez on drums. And it's very jazzy and quirky and has some kind of avant-garde, musical changes. And it's all over the place. It's like 13 minutes long. And this is pretty early on in me joining that tour. And my dad and I were splitting the sets. Like he would play a portion of it, I'd play a portion of it. But Bruce had told me that he wanted to play Kitty's Back that night as kind of a throwback to the old school, with the history of the Spectrum, and he wanted me to play it. And I was like, oh God, like that is a Herculean song that I hadn't played before. I had never actually sat down at the drums and played it. But he was expecting that we would play it that night, and he wanted me to play it. So I spent the majority of the show as my dad was playing, and those shows are 3.5 hours long. So I'm spending 3 hours basically, we understood that my dad was going to play the majority of the set, and then I would come on and play the encore, including Kitty's Back, and a couple other songs that I knew and had played in the tour at that point. So I spent about 3 hours just like woodshedding on a couch, this song Kitty's Back, and writing down shorthand because there are so many weird changes in this song, and it was daunting, but I literally got up on the drums at the beginning of the encore. I taped that cheat sheet to my floor tom and was kind of looking at it, kind of following along like, okay, that section is coming up. Okay, that weird fill and this weird section is coming up. And I got through the whole song by effectively just reading that cheat sheet, having never actually sat down at the drums and played it. And but that's kind of the E Street Band way. That's kind of the, the way Bruce likes to have that spontaneity and that, that genuine, authentic, real, raw experience. It's real. So, but having that lexicon of being able to, jot down a cheat sheet definitely helped me in an incredible, what would have been an impossible situation otherwise for me.
And as I learned from talking with your dad, actually what helped get him the gig was keeping an eye on Bruce.
That's right. Yeah, and that was helpful in my understanding of how to treat my role within that. Is that the E Street Band is very much a flying V. Like you said, it is a band and has that aspect, but it's a flying V to Bruce. So everybody is keyed in on his movements, his mannerisms, and that would help me literally in instances where he would call out a song I've never heard of before, and it would be expected of me to play. And watching his physicality and his mannerisms on stage allow me to be like, okay, it's this kind of a song. Okay, we're getting along. And then 4 or 5 minutes later, I've played a song that I've never even heard of in front of like 60,000 Swedish people, like that would happen. On the flip side of that, a band like Slipknot is 9 guys charging all at once, completely, right at the audience. And so having an understanding of those different dynamics, those different band dynamics is very important for how you carry yourself, for how you interact with your bandmates, all that stuff. Like all those dynamics of bands are different and unique to each situation. But having an awareness that each situation is unique allows you to kind of tailor your own artistry, your own drumming, your own personality on the instrument and cater it to each of those unique situations. So it does come across as genuine and authentic because it is, but you have to have an awareness of your surroundings to make it ring true in that way.
Is there any particular gig with the band or country or anything that really stands out in your mind?
Oh, sure. There are many, but to isolate one or maybe a few, yeah, it's kind of like you're always, battling the elements in certain ways, sometimes more than others, things that are out of your control. If you're sick one day, you're still on stage at 9 p.m., and the...
Don't drink the water, but you did, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So you have to, you have to completely, you have to have kind of mechanisms within yourself to just bypass and just perform and cut through and do it. And that is difficult. And you get that with experience. It's just inevitable that there are going to be challenges that are out of your control that you have to overcome. And I think a lot of success in music and being a part of really special moments is when you're faced with that adversity, how do you react to it and how do you overcome that adversity? For example, there's kind of a classic European routing that we'll do that doesn't allow for much sleep. So for instance, you're flying a lot of the time, and it's one of the things I hate the most is flying on a show day. It's just like a personal, like I never get in my flow when I'm on a bus or in a van. I'm able to have, I know what my day is going to be like, when I'll have breakfast, when I'll be able to, do all this stuff, have sound check and this and that. But when you're flying on the day of a show, you're like, oh my God, what if we can't take off on time? Everything's flown out of whack. What if we don't make it to the show on time and we can't play? Oh my God, like all these, scenarios. But we've had scenarios happen where, on the eve of a gigantic show, say for 100,000 people, we'll play like a smaller show that's no less important, certainly, but have like no sleep going into that next show. And you're just like, oh God, I got to bed at 5 a.m. because we had a 3-hour drive after we played and we were off stage at 2 a.m. And then we got to get to the airport, take a flight to this country. And then we're on stage headlining this festival, that's just enormous and a lot of, big pressure kind of situation and stuff that nobody else is really aware of that. But it's a dynamic that you just have to overcome, and all those factors kind of come into play. And myself, you know, being around seasoned professionals, veterans of the genre and veterans of music in general, you kind of take note of how those guys just cut through and you just do it. And so I think rising to that occasion is so much of it. But yeah, there's all those kinds of environmental factors. You know, at the beginning of a tour, you're all fresh faced and you got your, you know, you got your hair cut, you got your, you know, your muscles aren't necessarily fatigued after, you know, 6 weeks of touring and hardly any sleep, and not, you know, maybe you're not finding the best nutrition all over the place, whatever it may be. The show's the show and you got to deliver. And having that expectation of yourself, that expectation between each other, of us and the band, you know, that drives us to want to do our absolute best, because we treat every show, no matter who it's for, how many people it's for, you know, every show to me is for us, you know, and the respect that we have for the music. And so we give it 100%. And I think that that is what translates then to an audience, no matter if it's 5 people, 500 people, 5,000 people, or 50,000 people. Doesn't really matter to us. We always give it everything we got, which then at the end of a 2-month tour, you definitely feel it. But, you know, that's all part of it. That's why we fall in love with this music is, you know, at the end of the day, you have something to look back on and you're very proud of it. You're proud of what you built with your bandmates. And, you know, it's all about just kind of collecting those moments that you get to look back on and be like, wow, we did a good thing out there, you know, but it certainly takes a lot, for sure.
I can't thank you enough for taking time to talk with me today here.
You have always been such a key person in my life, in my drumming. I absolutely would not have picked up the sticks if it weren't for yourself and John Good, everybody at DW, and you know, it's such a key factors in me just picking up the sticks to begin with. So I owe you guys so much. So please, it's absolutely my pleasure to talk with you today.
Look forward to keeping more in touch for sure.
Definitely. Well, it's great to talk to you, Don. I can't wait to come out to Drum Channel someday and do some stuff proper with you guys. So thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah, you have that little break in there. I made some notes down here, so I'll be in touch with you sooner than later, that's for sure. And thank you for joining us. Be sure to check out everything on DC, along with 77 other Lombardi Live episodes, including one of my favorites with Jay's dad, Max Weinberg. Join us on YouTube, our YouTube channel. Certainly subscribe to it, and follow us on Instagram. See you next time.